Hi, and welcome to my presentation. Is persistence the key identification of the strategies associated with offline contact among online sex solicitors? So let's begin. Today, I will be defining what is online sex solicitation. I will also be introducing the main typology that we have for online sex solicitors and their MO. Then I'll present my study and the methodology that I've used. I'll also present some of the results and discuss the implication and limits to this study. So let's begin. Child luring, which is what we call online sex solicitation in the Canadian Criminal Code, refers to the act of communicating online with a minor with the intent to commit a sexual criminal offense. So to be arrested for this crime, there's not need to be a sexual act to have happen either online or offline. Is just the fact that you chatted with a minor with the intent to commit one of those crimes. However, for today, all of my sample had committed online sexual crimes. So let's begin. So this is the main typology that online sex solicitors. There are three types. Fantasy contacted mix. This comes from the study by Briggs in 2011. They interviewed 51 offenders in Colorado and came up with this typology. So let's begin. Fantasy driven are offenders that go online to chat with minor for the sole purpose of realizing some sexual fantasies. They have no interest in going offline, and they build a relationship with the minor over time before arriving to sexual exploitation. In contrast, we have the contact-driven, which in this case, the offenders use the internet in order to meet the victims offline. The volume of victim they create is a lot bigger than the fantasy-driven because they introduce sexual content really quickly, and they will not waste their time if the victim is not open to contact offline. Whereas, as stated, the fantasy-driven offenders will build a relationship. So they'll focus maybe on a smaller number, but victimize the victims over time. Whereas contact offenders will really just go as many as possible, as many as they can in a very short period of time. And then we have a mixed typology, which is a type of offender who share both of these contact and fantasy-driven characteristic. So they could use the internet to fulfill sexual fantasies and to go offline. It will depend. So if we go to my study, my goal was to identify the strategies associated with interaction that led to an offline contact in the discourses of offenders. So to do so, I compared three different types of interaction to be able to pinpoint exactly the characteristic of each. So the first one was online-only interaction offenders. And in these group, it's a lot like the fantasy-driven because they chatted online, they sexted, they realized some sexual fantasies, but never asked their victims to meet offline. The second group, which is the attempt at contact interaction group, they also sexted with minors. They realized sexual fantasies. They asked their victim to go offline at least once, but the interaction ended online. So there was no contact offline with the victims. The third group, which is now kind of evident, is the contact group. And these ones all chatted online with victims, sexted, asked their victims to meet offline at least once, and the interaction ended with an offline contact. For this presentation, I'm going to focus on the results of two groups because of the time frame. So I'll be focusing on the attempt at contact interaction and contact interaction to be able to pinpoint these differences. So to do this project, which was done with the collaboration of the SQ, I studied the cases of 18 male offenders. They were all arrested between 2008 and 2016. They're all closed cases, so they were either found guilty or pled guilty to child luring at least once. Their ages varied from 19 to 59, with an average of 32 and a standard deviation of 12. There's 52 victims in total between the age of 11 and 17. So you can do a quick math and realize that most of these offenders had more than one victim. And I think I coded to the max with 7 victims per offender. In total, there was 829 conversations that were analyzed and grouped into 52 interaction. So in most cases, offenders talk to their victims on more than one occasion. But for today, my N will be of 30 because I'm focusing solely on 2 groups. So to do so, my methodology for this is I took all the transcript and put them into NVivo. And what I did was I looked at all the strategies that I had for the presence and then the frequency of how they were used per group throughout the entire interaction. So obviously this presentation is a small part of the bigger project, so I didn't include all the strategies that I coded. But here are several of these. So bribery is when an offender would offer money or gifts to a victim for sexual favors. An opportunity was when an offender was presented with a time, a place, and limited risk to meeting their victim. Presentation of themselves as harmless is when an offender would try to reassure the victim that they weren't dangerous. Gathering of sexual information is 3 types of question. It's when an offender will ask about the victim's physique, so what she looks like, how she dressed. Questions about sexual past is also another type. It's when an offender would ask question about the sexual experiences in the past of the victim. So it's mainly to establish where they're at their level of their sexuality. The last type of question we have is also questions about sex, but it's about the sexual practices and preferences of the victim. So if there's something they enjoy doing, they don't, what are they used to? Online and offline receptivity is basically when an offender will just verify if the victim is open to either offline contact or sexual content. Persistence is when an offender will repeat a question or a statement that was sexually driven or asking to go offline when the victim either ignores him or if she just told him she wasn't going to answer and he just kept pushing. Fantasy rehearsal is during sexting. They would be the 2 would talk about the sexual act they would be performing when they meet offline. The number of offline demand it's a stat. It's just how many times over the course of the interaction, the total interaction, how many times did the offender ask to meet their victim offline? So here are some of the results. I did a Crosco-Wallace H test because my distribution were not normal. I had offenders that had 1 conversation. I had others that had 394, which means that anything but averages would be skewed because I had some too many offenders with very large number of conversation and others with like just 1 or 2. So here are the results. I have 4 strategies that were significantly associated with one particular group. Presentation of themselves as harmless, persistence, offline demands, and opportunity. You can see with the median that all of the strategies were used more often by the contact group and not the attempt at contact. It's much more evident in the persistence and the opportunity strategies that they were used more often. So if we start talking more about the implication and discussing what these results mean, it's not much of a result because of the N is so small. However, it is very interesting because in the contact interaction group, they had a higher number of conversation, which allowed them to have the opportunity to discover more opportunities, show themselves less dangerous and more trustworthy over time, and show persistence. Although these are separate results, combining them furthers our understanding as to what could convince them to meet their offender offline. Logically, these results make sense because if we go with the logic that a victim would probably, if she's terrified, she probably wouldn't go offline to meet them. If there's an opportunity, there's more chances of an offender going than if he doesn't. Because if a victim says, my parents are home, my dad's a cop, chances of the offender going to the person's house and opening the window to go into the child's bedroom is less likely. What does this mean for police practices? Well, it is still very early to talk about changes in police practices. However, this doesn't mean that it's not interesting, because these 4 strategies, or these 4 results, are easy to find in a transcript. So you can keep them in mind when you're reading the transcript between a victim and offender, and just like have a mental checklist of, the possibility that a contact could occur. Because even though persistence looks to be like the hardest to see in a transcript, it's actually one of the easiest, because the offenders who show persistence, it was evident because they were persistent to the point of being annoying. So they were just restless. They just kept asking and bugging. So part of the reasoning that that led to an offline contact is they probably just worn down the victim. They were just so tired. They were like, if I do this, he will shut up. So it is possible. The also thing it's important to keep in mind is the average in age of offenders that went offline. As stated before, the average of age was 32, but with 12 years of standard deviation. The contact offender, for the most part, were below the age of 25 and met their victims because they were at the same high school. The offender had graduated a few years prior, and it was just kind of a hang around. And these offenders made multiple victims in the same school because they had heard of each other, and there was that presentation of themselves as harmless through others before. So it is something to keep in mind when you're reading transcript, especially for police force, because if the person lies about their identity and they're 50, chances of offline contacts were a little lower than if the person was like 19 and hanging around a high school. So it is still like those results, even though they're still really early, they're still very interesting. The other thing is an offender who asked contact on multiple occasions over the course of the interaction. It's also very easy to see, but it can also show you that they're very persistent in what they want, and they will not take no for an answer. They just keep asking until it's a yes. And then opportunities, well, as I stated before, it's one of those you can easily see in a transcript. It will often be just a time and a place, and something about it being okay to see each other. So if we start talking more about the limits of this project, there are 2 main limits. The first one is obvious, the small sample size. At this point, it's impossible to do multivariate analysis with 52 cases. However, we hope to be able to up that N over the next few months after COVID, because right now it is impossible to be on location to do this. The other limit to this project is also the fact that when the offenders were arrested, their computers and their phone were seized at the time of the arrest. And what they did is the cops, they just put everything on a hard drive and just gave it to us. And a lot of it was just conversation with no name, no ID. Some of them were adults mixed with children. Some of them were like from group chats. So anything in that is hard to code. It's also, there's a lot of missing information. Anything that was over the phone, we do not have access to. Anything on video chat, we also don't have access to those transcripts. So when you're coding, it's a little hard sometimes to catch everything, just because you can read that they had talked to each other on a previous conversation that you do not have. So it is possible that some of these results are a little skewed because of that, but it is what it is, and we do with what we can. The future of this research, as stated, is increase the N as much as possible. The only thing is the number of offenders who go offline is not that many. It's not the majority, especially if it's a real victim. If it's in a case where the police was a decoy, chances there were a lot more of those cases of offender going, which tells us that the focus should also be on the victim's behavior, because it does play out in the outcome. This research also, for the overall thesis, studied a little bit about the victim's online behavior and how that impacted the outcome. So that is something to keep going and keep seeing what could play, how could that play out in in knowing the MO better and how to put things in perspective and new ways of working. So these are the references. There are a lot more, but if ever, these are the references. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope you liked it. If you have any more questions or you would like to know more about the results, or there was another group you wanted to know more about, feel free to email me. I remain available. And thank you so much for your time. Have a great day.